As we move in history further and further away from the event at Mount Sinai, we assume, logically, that we lose some of the inspiration, we lose some of the strength, we lose some of the knowledge, and certainly some of the holiness. As we move further along in history from the times of the temple, from the Beis Hamikdash, the first temple, the second temple, we assume that we are losing ground. We're getting further and further away from the original message, and the relationship with God is getting weaker. I guess like any neglected relationship. And so we wonder, where's the hope? Where's the good news? Another issue, there are mitzvahs, commandments, that are in the Torah, explicitly stated. There are those mitzvahs in Torah that have to be derived by the sages through the methods given by God on how to define the details of a mitzvah. What did Moshe say when he came down off the mountain? For example, you shall bind them as a sign on your arm and frontlets between your eyes. That's a commandment. But what in the world is it saying? What does it mean to bind the words of the Torah on your arm? Well, when Moshe came down off the mountain and he quoted God as saying, this is what you must do, he was quite aware and proficient in how to do it, how to make the tefillin and how to wear the tefillin. It has to be made out of leather, it has to have straps, it has to have certain scrolls of certain chapters of the Torah. That's called the oral law. The information that Moshe came down off the mountain with that was not written in the script. So you have the explicit, detailed commandments written in the Torah. You have those that are oral tradition from Moshe from the Torah. You have those that are derived logically from the wording of the Torah. And then you have commandments that are called rabbinic, like observing Purim. That's not written in the Torah, it happened much later. Not in the 5 books, anyway. And then there's Hanukkah, which is even later. At least Purim has a scroll of Esther. Hanukkah has nothing. It's purely rabbinic. Lighting Shabbos candles is rabbinic. So you have the 7 rabbinic mitzvahs. And then you have customs. Then you have rabbinic precautionary methods or aids, things that prevent you from accidentally or inadvertently violating a commandment. And in most recent times, you have the differences between Hasidic customs and non-Hasidic customs, Sephardic custom, Ashkenazi customs. What is all that? How are we supposed to view these rabbinic innovations? So here's the punchline, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. The punchline is, these later, more recently introduced principles, which we call customs, are in some way holier than the original commandments in the Torah. And that's why they came later in history. After much experience, after mastering the earlier parts, the original mitzvahs, then we were ready to receive more, the deeper, the more intimate, the more powerful. Again, like any relationship, with time, it can get deeper, more personal, more intimate, less mechanical. So let's take a look a little bit at the history of things. We start off with Noah. Noach was a tzaddik, the Torah says. He found favor in God's eyes. Noach motza chen be'enei Hashem. And yet the rabbis don't hesitate to offer two extreme opinions, extremely different from each other. One says that Noach was the greatest of tzaddikim because even in a generation that was so bad and so evil and so corrupt as his generation, how corrupt? They had to be wiped out with a flood. And yet, surrounded by all of that, he was righteous. He walked with God. Pretty impressive. The other opinion is the exact opposite. In his generation, compared to the others, he was righteous. But had he been in a generation of truly righteous people, he wouldn't be considered righteous at all. What does this mean? How can both opinions, and they're both from Torah sages, they both must be true? How can they both be true? So if we compare Noach to Avraham, Noach was a tzaddik without a doubt because Torah says it explicitly. He walked with God, spelled it right out. He found favor in God's eyes. There's no mystery here. He was indeed a tzaddik. But this is early in history, when people were experimenting with humanity. See, it wasn't a matter of obeying God, believing in God, worshiping God. That was not the issue. God was very real to them. I mean, the world was new. You had to wonder, where did it come from? Who created all this? So their awareness of God was pretty strong. But they didn't know how to treat each other. They didn't know how to be a mensch, They didn't know how to be human. That was a new experience. So they were experimenting with every kind of possible lifestyle, behavior, character, and it was pretty bad. Noach, on the other hand, was decent. He was not destructive socially. And so he got to be on the ark. The problem is that although he was a mensch, he didn't influence anybody else. So he was a tzaddik in his own life, in his own behavior, but influencing the world was not part of it. You can compare it to a child, a good child, who does everything right. But he doesn't have influence on others. Being good and being right in yourself, that's a full-time job. So Noach found favor in God's eyes, as an individual. He was charming, he was delightful. But in 120 years of building the ark, he didn't convince a single other family or even individual to join him. So socially, he was not very effective. Avraham, on the other hand, started a movement. Avraham became famous as a teacher, as an influencer, beginning with his own family, with his own parents, weaning them away from idolatry, challenging the world to rethink their beliefs about God. Between the time of Noach and the rise of Avraham, there was a generation called the generation of the Tower. The people of the Tower of Babel, about 1,000 years after the flood, they decided that they no longer believe that God runs the world. They were now very scientifically advanced, and they were. This is the year, approximately, the year 2000 after Adam and Eve. But they had learned after the flood to get along, to cooperate, to be sociable. And so they all got together, the entire human population at the time, got together on a project to build this great tower to bring them, to carry them out of Earth's atmosphere, because they had decided scientifically that Earth was a dangerous place. Unstable atmospheric conditions that will bring a flood every 1,000 years. Which means they did not believe that God had caused the flood. They were convinced that the flood was a natural phenomenon and they had to do something about it themselves, and they had to get out of Earth's atmosphere and make it to the moon. God didn't like that little project, so he caused groups of people to develop their own language. So instead of all being united in one language and in one goal and one project, they suddenly found themselves different people speaking different languages, which is the only good explanation for why there's more than one language. But the result was that those who found themselves speaking the same language moved away and created their own societies, their own cities, their own countries. So they had gone from being okay with God, but not okay with each other. That was the generation of the flood. Then they became okay with each other, but not so okay with God. That was the generation of the tower. Now Abraham comes along, Avraham comes along, and he's good on both counts. He is social, he is an influencer, he has a language that people can relate to, he can explain, he can teach, he can inspire, and his relationship with God was awesome. Both at the same time. A little bit of heaven with a little bit of earth. So, what does it say about Noach? Noach walked with God, with God's support. Avraham, on the other hand, walked before God. Or God himself says, "Walk before me and I will bless you." Walk before me means on your own initiative. Use your inherent godliness, the godliness of your soul, to inspire the world, and I will bless your efforts. In other words, the relationship with God had become a little more than just a good kid. Now it was more of an adult kind of godliness, where you're not content to be good yourself. You have some concern or some responsibility for the people around you. The result is a real mensch, an adult, developed, actualized human being. And so it was with Yitzchak, and with Yaakov, and with Yosef, and with Moshe. And then in the year 2448, the Torah is given. God comes down to Mount Sinai and reveals himself. Everything changed for the better. So, we're charting the progress here of how the world gets closer to its objective. What was the change? The change was, it's no longer enough to be a really decent, developed, magnificent human being, both in your relationship with God and your relationship with others, with the world. Now, it was all about God. Transcend the human perfection. Because Avraham was 75 years old and he was a perfect human being. God came to him and said, I have a mitzvah for you to perform. Circumcision. It was the first mitzvah given by God after the 7 Noahide laws. That was the beginning of the 2,000 years of Torah. After the chaotic childhood or adolescent years, which was 2,000 years from creation to Avraham, now started 2,000 years of Torah. Torah meaning bring God into the picture. Not personally as part of your own perfection or actualization, but for God's purpose. So God tells Avraham at the age of 75, you're a real mensch. You're the kind of person I can relate to. And I'm here to tell you that it's not enough. It's not enough to be a perfect human being. You have to be a godly being. How do you do that? I will reveal myself. Step by step, gradually, so that you can grow in godliness and you will be able to live a life that is my kind of life, much more than just a human being. So it began with Avraham and it concluded with, or it came to its high point with Moshe, when he brought the commandments down from Mount Sinai. And over the 40 years in the desert, gave us the entire Torah. Now we know God. Now we can be godly. So have we progressed? Absolutely. Then, to make it brief, in the year 3406, that's 1,000 years later, approximately, after the giving of the Torah, there was the story of Purim, the Megillah, the scroll of Esther. And the sages tell us that what happened as a result of the threat of annihilation and the miracle that saved them from that threat, something changed in the entire Jewish experience. And the people were able to fulfill the Torah, to live up to the Torah in a way that they hadn't since the Torah was given. They fulfilled what they had accepted. They had accepted the Torah at Mount Sinai 1,000 years earlier, and now they were actually fulfilling it in a much deeper way than before. What this tells us is that the further we get from Mount Sinai, the further we get from creation, the further we get from Avraham, the greater our relationship with God becomes. Despite the changes, the differences. The story of Purim happened in exile after the temples had been destroyed. After the first temple had been destroyed. First exile. Scattered in 127 countries. The Jews had a renaissance. Not a return to what was. A deepening of the relationship. They finally realized how significant, how deep, how real the connection to God was. It wasn't just an obedience. It was an internalization. In some way, which we can explain on another occasion, the godliness became them. Not just something they believed in and obeyed and practiced. They became the Torah. Or the Torah became them. Let's move on. About 500 years later. The oral Torah, all the teachings that Moshe came down the mountain with, and orally taught to the people in the 40 years in the desert. And then every generation had its teachers who passed on the tradition, the oral teachings from one generation to the next, from teacher to student. About 500 years later, there was a need to record all this oral stuff. Because it was oral, it all depended on people's memory or on the flawlessness of the transition. Did the student really understand the fine nuances of what the teacher was conveying? Not every teacher is so expert in communication that the original message doesn't get a little tainted. So after 500 years, the scholars all sat down and shared what they had been taught, compared notes to see if they're all on the same page, worked out the differences until they tracked things down to their original teachings, and recorded the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda, the prince, compiled all the Mishnah, which was all of the oral law that came along with the written Torah, but was not allowed to be written. It was meant to be oral until that time. What was the purpose of it being oral? Well, if you had to memorize it and you had to transmit it from generation to generation, you had to really get to know it. If it's already recorded, you can just always look it up. You don't have to memorize it by heart. You don't have to understand it perfectly. You look it up. It's right there on the shelf. But because it was oral, it had to be ingested. It had to be internalized. It became part of their DNA. Now it was ready to be recorded. Was that a step down? in a sense, the need to record it was because memory fails. Oral transition can be distorted. It is fallible. So it was written down. That seems to suggest that people were drifting, getting further away from the truth of Torah. But the opposite can also be true. It had become so internalized that it no longer needed to be oral. It can actually be committed to writing. In the process of writing the Mishnah, new insights came to light. Let's move on a few years, a few hundred years. In the year 41, approximately 4107 or 87, 4187, the Talmud was recorded. Now, what is the Talmud? A discussion on the Mishnah, because the Mishnah recorded conclusions, but not the reasoning behind it. And the Talmud is the sages reviewing all the Mishnah and going through all the reasoning and arguments and insights and so on, clarifying even more the things that had remained a little vague. Again, in that process, they discovered new things because they revisited the scripture, they revisited the commandments, and more was discovered than was known before. Only this time it didn't come as a voice from heaven. It didn't come through prophecy. It came through wisdom. Now we're talking about sages. The era of the prophets was over. So we no longer had prophets. Step down in some way, but in another way, it was a step up. It deepened the relationship with God and with Torah. It revealed layers of soul that the Jews had that they hadn't tapped before. I guess you could say that in the beginning of a relationship, what does a couple reveal or share with each other? The safe stuff, the practical, the everyday, the essentials, not the more subtle, intimate stuff. That comes with time. That comes with maturity. And so, as we go further in history, our relationship with God matures, and through wisdom, through insight, through sensitivity and empathy with God, we get to know Him better. And we discover things that God prefers or dislikes that we never knew before. This is the unfolding of Torah. There is much more. Got to bring it up to date to our times. Stand by for part 2. If you enjoyed this conversation or this topic, and you're looking for more information, or you want to hear it again from another angle, there is a way to do that. And that is in this book. It's all there. Order it from Amazon. You can read it, reread it, and share it. We have a Sunday night program for VIPs that you might be interested in. It's informal. It's questions and answers. It's conversation. It's really relaxed. It's really pleasant, enjoyable, informative, and kind of community-like. It's a Sunday night program. There's a Wednesday morning program for the VIPs, and there's a Wednesday night program. all of it just conversation, casual, laid back, unscripted. So join us, take a look, click the link below and see which of the three suits you best, and join us for some enjoyable conversation.